Hello plant lovers, it is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you back to my channel. Thank you very much for finding me. If you're new here, I grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia, without a greenhouse or grow lights or humidifiers, just me and them, indoors or outdoors, or they're out of the pool. So, if that sounds like your conditions, do hit subscribe. I post every week on a Friday and I'm a complete amateur, so my ramblings are my learnings about what works for me here in Melbourne. They might not be the best way or the only way or the right way, but it's what works for me and it might help you. Which cunningly brings us to what is kind of obviously the subject matter of our video this week, Australian Sarcochilus orchids. And yes, it is Sarcochilus time. I'm filming this in late spring here in Australia and they are all just about in bloom. I have one hybrid that hasn't quite opened yet, but it's missed the bus. So here we are. Why don't we do a very quick overview of Sarcochilus? I've made many a video, a basic care video and repotting, etc., which I'll link above and below, so you can have a look at all of those for specifics, but we might just look at the flower range this year and a broad stroke idea of care. But first, Sarcochilus, what does it mean? The name comes from the Greek and the two components are sarx, S-A-R-X, sort of meaning flesh, and chilios, meaning lip, fleshy lip. You know what? I've seen orchids with fleshier lips, just saying. Anyway, that's where Sarcochilus comes from. And Sarcochilus hartmanii is the sort of the mummy of them all, the daddy of them all. This is the species orchid that grows in Eastern Australia. And I'll show you in a minute exactly where, because the Bible of Australian orchids will tell us. But it was named in 1874 by Ferdinand von Müller, who was the first director of the Melbourne Botanic Gardens. And it was named after a specimen plant that was found by a chap called Karl Heinrich Hartmann, hence hartmanii, in an area called Toowoomba, which I will also show you on the map. So there you are. There's our Sarcochilus naming 101, and the principal species type that many of the hybrids have come from is this one, hartmanii. But let us consult the good book, The Complete Edition of Australian Orchids by W.H. Nichols. This book I got in a vintage store for 75 Australian dollars, which is great. It is a brilliant book. The botanic illustrations are from the 30s. My edition is from 1969 and it was kind of written in the 50s and the 40s. So a lot of the information has been superseded, so names have changed. But generally, it is a great basis for understanding Australian orchids. And Sarcochilus, plant lovers, are a small genus of 11 species, almost exclusively Australian, with one species extending to New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. And a little clue then about care, because the book also tells us where hartmanii grows, and it is an epiphyte or a lithophyte, and hartmanii particularly grows in full sunshine on cliffs and rock ledges, or occasionally on the bark at the butts of trees, with its roots penetrating the top layer of leaves and soil. So plant lovers, full sun. Now, this is the basic care for Sarcochilus. I have done a video before, but we'll just go over that. So the book says they can take full sun, and they can, like Australian Dendrobium, Kingianums and Speciosums can, and they bloom brilliantly in full sun, but you are going to get very, very sunburnt leaves. So that's the thing. When you see these plants in the wild, they often look really ragged because they've been eaten by insects and they've been burnt by the sun, and they go through periods of quite extreme drought. So when you're growing them in pot culture, you kind of got to find a good compromise. But essentially, Sarcochilus need sunlight, and they particularly need sunlight in winter because that is when the flower spikes are stimulated to produce, and lack of light is probably going to be the principal reason why you don't get any flowers. Now, mine grow outdoors under cover, and I'll link my grow space video which shows you exactly where. So they get fairly strong filtered indirect light, but in the morning they do get direct light, and as the season changes in the afternoon they can also get direct light as well. So they probably get maybe 2 or 3 hours a day of direct sun and then bright indirect light. I would say that's probably on the too shady side of the spectrum. But hartmanii this year has got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 spikes. So not bad. But essentially, every growth point should produce at least 1 or 2 spikes. So you can really get absolute cascades and waterfalls. So I'm hoping in our new place, I can give these a spot where they're getting more light. I will, though, protect them from the harsh afternoon light here in Melbourne, because we get vicious summer western light as the sun is setting and it's really burning and hot. So I kind of like my leaves to look nice, so I will not be giving them that extreme sunlight, which the book says they can take. So the other, I guess, quick thing to point out, as the book says, they're lithophytic, so they're growing in nooks in cliff faces, or epiphytic, they're growing in sort of nooks in trees, is that water comes, water goes. It will evaporate very quickly when it rains, and then being Australia and depending where they're coming from, there could be quite some time in between rains, so it will really dry out. So don't get hung up about watering. The only thing is, don't overwater them. On the drier side, particularly in winter if you're growing them in pot culture somewhere other than Australia, and just ramp it up a little bit in spring and summer. But again, they're not orchids that like to be moist all the time, so treat them a little mean. And I'm a little lax with feeding. I do give them a topical slow release fertilize in spring. Many Australian plants grow in quite harsh conditions with quite infertile soil in comparison to, say, other orchid species growing in the world. So they're quite tough and not something to overfeed, I feel. Anyway, so I do give them a topical feed of slow release in spring, and if I remember, because they're all outside, I will give them a liquid diluted orchid feed solution or a tonic, which could be seaweed based or worm juice, maybe every 4 or 5 waterings during the warmer season. But anyway, let us talk about the flowers. So I'm filming this in late spring. Hartmanii here is the species orchid, and this is the first one to bloom for me always. The flowers open first, and in fact, quite a lot of these are going over now. The hybrid cousins, most of these are hybridized from Hartmanii, but also another species called Fitzgeraldii. So these all open slightly at different periods. So a great idea if you're building a collection, definitely get a species Hartmanii. It will open first, and then maybe a couple of colorways, because you'll then get successive blooming. So you should maybe get, if you're lucky, a sort of a 6 to 8 window where different plants are flowering all the time. But generally, early spring, moving on to late spring, depending where you are in the country here in Australia, it can be a little earlier if you're further north, a little later if you're further south. I've always thought there was no fragrance, but I'm sitting here with all of these beautiful plants in bloom, and there is a general soft fragrance in the air. Plant, I was just saying, I can't tell you specifically that one is fragrant, but there definitely is a fragrance in the air, and it's very lovely. Light and floral, who knew? But let's sort of go through why I've chosen these. Now, you can perhaps already see that I have made a few mistakes. I was trying to get a sort of a range of colors and speckling so that when they're all in bloom, there would be these blobs of cascades of color, and each one will be slightly different. What I've ended up with, though, plant lovers, is, as you can see, a lot of red. Hey ho. Because often when you buy a seedling, particularly here in Australia, the plant hasn't flowered yet. So you'll get a tag like that, which shows you the 2 crosses that have been crossed to produce the new hybrid. So it's impossible to know what it's going to look like. And this one has a sort of, a slightly more ochre burgundy red with very, very faint white tinges to the flowers. Hardly that different from anything else, but anyway. So I think I am really going to lay off getting any more Sarcochilus unless they're particularly pink or particularly yellow. So sort of apricot-y yellow was I guess the holy grail, I suppose, of Sarcochilus. So they've been hybridized a lot in Australia. Every year there is a ton of new seedling crosses coming out. So it's very easy and relatively inexpensive to build a collection. The other good news with seedling Sarcochilus is that they will bloom very quickly. You might only have to wait 2 years before you get flowers. Now this is a small plant, as you can see, and we have got 2 spikes from the stem. So basic structural things then, your plant grows in this manner. So that kind of looks not unlike a vanda. And this stem then produces the flower spikes in the juncture of the leaf there, the little axis point there. Again, like many orchids. The difference being, though, that this growth point can continue to bloom and will continue to bloom until that growth point dies. So, many orchids will only flower once from a pseudobulb spot and then that pseudobulb dies and you have to produce a new one in the next year to produce the flower, etc. Sarcochilus will bloom successively from the same growth as long as that growth is still alive. What they won't do is flower from the same leaf juncture. So that does change over time. But you generally get enough growth to give you the room for flower spikes. So that's not unlike how a Phalaenopsis will produce its flower spikes, which is in that same leaf juncture. Sort of as the plant grows, you'll get them coming up the stem of the plant. So yeah, sort of slightly similar habits to a few other orchids. So Hartmannii, the species, is basically white with these small little deep red elements in the middle. And then we have every version thereof. So this one here, this is a stunning hybrid. And as you can see, the flowers are really wide and largely white with sort of pink spots. A really fantastic hybrid. And I bought that one kind of sight unseen from a nursery. It was on sale because the flower spike had died and no one apart from me will buy an orchid with a dead flower spike. But I thought, why not? Super cheap. And I'm actually really happy. That's one of the most interesting hybrids I actually have. The other one, I was really keen to get something in the yellow spectrum. In fact, I think it's sort of more apricot, really, if we're going to split hairs. But there you go. So you can see so this one has largely white outside with that sort of apricot-y yellow interior. And again, the yellows and apricot spectrum is a color spectrum that is really being worked a lot through at the moment with hybridizers to see how you can get different versions of that. This is a fabulous velvety red orchid, and I actually made a video about repotting this one. Really, really beautiful. The interesting thing with that one is that the underside of the flowers, I don't know if you can see, but I'll show you. Can we see? Anyway, they're quite speckled. So when the flowers were about to open, I thought, oh no, it's another spotted flower. But when they open, the outside of the flower is completely that beautiful velvety burgundy. This one, again, not dissimilar, a little bit of white spotting. And then this one I bought because I just felt the flowers were a little more open. And Fitzgeraldii, one of the other species type, the petals and sepals are much more separated on that flower. So it's kind of more open. Whereas in Hartmannii, they're quite tightly bound in the flower structure. So this one I liked because it's kind of more open and sort of daisy-like. Anyway, that was the reason. Essentially the color though is quite the same. But I must say, these orchids are so low maintenance. This is the type of plant you can go on holiday for 4 weeks and not water them. They'll be alive when you come back. The thing is, don't overwater them because they won't like that. Pretty vigorous growers. So as you can see, you get multiple growth points in a plant, and that will start happening really quickly in sort of year 2 of the seedling. And you probably could get blooms in the 2nd year of the seedling's life. So really good value for the impatient orchid collector, but also good value because they're quite inexpensive as seedlings here in Australia. I know on the west coast of the USA, there is quite a lot of Sarcochilus hybridizing going on. So I think it's quite easy to get plants over there. Not so sure about Britain, but anyway. So my ambition is to get good sized specimen plants like my Hartmannii here, which I have owned for about 6 years, and it was already an established plant when I bought it. I bought it from a car boot sale, so there you go. Whereas most of these other ones I bought from plant sales, orchid meets. Beautiful orchids, they make such a great display. They are so easy, they are so low maintenance, they're vigorous growers, they don't need particularly any care when it comes to water, don't care about humidity, mine are just outside all the time. What more could you want? There you are, plant lovers. I will link all my other Sarcochilus orchid videos below. I think I have a playlist which I will link. Have a browse through those. There's basic care and there's repotting. I pot mine all in out of the bag orchid mix, super cheap, light, free draining. They all seem happy. But my other videos go through all of that. I use clay pots because I'm a terracotta pot kind of guy. I didn't repot this one yet because it's in bloom when I bought it. I only bought this about a month ago. So it's still in black plastic, and black plastic is not recyclable. This is one of my issues about plastic pots. But anyway, all of that information is on those other videos. I just wanted to show you what they're looking like. So I'm kind of getting towards my ambition of blocks of fabulous cascading color. I think I might need something that's actually more white based with a few spots of color, just to break up all this red that I've accidentally found myself with. One of the reasons for that is that you buy the seedling and you just don't know what the flower's going to look like. Anyway, I don't need to justify myself. Plant lovers, thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions about Sarcochilus, feel free to put them below. As I said, I'm an amateur, but I've stumbled my way through of getting them to be relatively happy here in Melbourne. Not a difficult orchid to grow, so I'm happy to share whatever I might know to see if it works for you. But in the meantime, from late spring in Australia, from Sarcochilus bloom time, we are saying farewell. Thank you very much for watching. I post every week on a Friday, so do hit subscribe if you've enjoyed this. And I, and perhaps Sarcochilus, look forward to seeing you next week.